Find the derivative of y equals f of x over the square root of x, then evaluate y prime of 16, where f of 16 is 2 and f prime of 16 is 5. Y here is the quotient of an unknown function f of x divided by or over the square root of x. The first thing I'm going to do is rewrite that square root of x as a fractional exponent. It's x to the first power and then second root, so x to the 1/2. We'll need that for the derivative. Since we have a quotient, we will use the quotient rule for the derivative. Y prime, or dy dx, will be the derivative of the numerator, f prime of x, times the denominator left alone, x to the 1/2, minus the numerator left alone, f of x, times the derivative of the denominator, that means power rule, 1/2 x to the subtract 1, I will call it minus 2/2. And then that entire thing will be divided by the denominator quantity squared, x to the 1/2 and then squared. Back in the numerator we will have f prime of x times x to the 1/2, which means second root of x to the first power, so just root x, minus f of x times 1/2 x to the 1 minus 2, which is negative 1/2, and then all this over x to the 1/2 to the 2. You actually multiply the exponents there, so 1/2 times 2, which will give us 2/2, which will reduce to a 1 in our next step. So y prime, or dy dx, will equal to, that first term I'm going to move the root x to the front, so I will call it root x and then f prime of x. And then we have minus, now in the numerator we will have this f of x and this 1. Those will multiply each other, so that'll give us a f of x, and then the x to the negative 1/2 is going to move to the denominator with the 2. There's already a 2 down there. We're going to move this down to the denominator with that 2. So we will have f of x and then over 2x to the positive 1/2. That's why we moved it down, to make it a positive exponent. This entire thing is divided by x to the 2/2, or x to the 1. So what we have here is the square root of x times f prime of x minus f of x over 2, and then x to the 1/2 means square root of x to the first power, so square root of x. And I'll have this divided by x. I'm going to want to simplify this a little bit further, so I'm going to get a common denominator between those two terms in the numerator, since one of them has a denominator. I'm going to multiply this first one by 2 square root of x over 2 square root of x for the common denominator. And when I multiplying this times this, we will have a 2, and then a root x times a root x is an x. So we will have a 2x multiplying the f prime of x in the numerator of that one. We have a minus f of x in the numerator of the other one, and they're over a common denominator of 2 square root of x. Now this entire thing is over x to the first power, but since I now have a fraction in the numerator, I'm going to want a fraction in the denominator so I can reciprocate and multiply. Let's put that over a 1 so we can reciprocate it. So y prime, or dy dx, is now equal to 2x f prime of x minus f of x over 2 square root of x. I'm going to rename that x to the 1/2, and the reason I'm going to do that is when I reciprocate and multiply, I'm going to be able to combine those x's by adding their exponents. I have to multiply the denominator there, and I'm going to want to add those. So I have in the numerator 2x f prime of x minus f of x. All of that is multiplying with 1, so that will just remain as 2x f prime of x minus f of x. And in the denominator, I have 2x to the 1/2 and x to the 1, which I will call 2 halves. We can add their exponents together, so we have 2x f prime of x minus f of x, and all of this is over 2x to the, add 1 plus 2, 3 over 2. There's our derivative y prime. Now the next step is to evaluate y prime of 16, and that means to plug a 16 into each of our x's. So we will have 2 times 16 times f prime of 16 minus f of 16. All of this is divided by 2 times 16 to the 3/2 power. Now in the numerator, 2 times 16 is 32. F prime of 16 we're going to find from up here, and f of 16 for that matter is also up there. F prime of 16 is a 5, minus f of 16 is a 2. All of that divided by 2 times 16 to the 3/2. 16 to the 3/2 means take the square root of 16, which is a 4, and then cube that result. Then the numerator, 32 times 5, that's 160, minus 2, over 2 times 4 times 4, 16 times 1 more 4 is a 64. 160 minus 2 is 158. 2 times 64 is 128. Both of these are even, so they're reducible by at least a 2. If we divide by 2, the numerator will become a 79, and the denominator will become a 64. And there's no further common divisor between those, so we will leave it as 79 over 64.